What's up guys, it's Nick Kutse here from Mitochondria and welcome to this video where we're going to be covering seasonal eating. In a previous video we covered meal timing and how that affects your circadian rhythm. And seasonal eating isn't necessarily something that is going to set your rhythm on a day-to-day basis, but it is something you should be paying attention to because it links in with a lot of other factors such as your light environment. Now, today's video, I just want to say from the beginning, is not going to give you a specific meal plan or the type of food that you should be eating. There's many variables that you need to consider with seasonal eating, and that could be obviously your location, but even your genetics. So what I'm going to do, this video is basically going to provide you with the tools so that you can go out there and then figure out, exactly what works best for you, given your environment, given your genetics, what you think would be in your environment or how your ancestors would have eaten. It's also going to give you some tools in order to, make sure that you're not just eating how your ancestors would, because obviously you live under different stresses than they do in a modern society. So how do we, counter that with some of the food choices that we make? So just to give you an overview of what we're going to be covering in this video, three things that we're going to be covering is why seasonal eating, why would it be better for you? The second part is going to be the link between light and your diet. And the third part is going to be diet hacks for a modern lifestyle. As I already mentioned, you don't always want to be eating exactly like your ancestors would. We live in a very different environment these days. Things have changed rapidly over the last 100 years, and that's not a long enough time span for our genes to evolve. So there are some kind of tweaks that we're going to be discussing at the end, just to make sure that you're eating, or at least attempting to eat, a diet that might be better at adjusting to a modern lifestyle. So before we jump into the very first section, I just want to cover something, and that is the whole thing of seasonality and meat versus fruit or vegetables or any plants for that matter. So when it comes to seasonality, 99% of the time you're going to be talking about fruit and vegetables because they have a seasonal kind of variation. You're not going to get fruit and vegetables in winter in certain parts of the world, or even in some parts of the world you will hardly ever get any kind of fruit or plant matter. Whereas meat tends to be quite a stable kind of source of food. It's something our ancestors would have based. It's a big bulk focus of a majority of diets. And if you look out in nature, there's no society that's ever existed without having meat as some form of component of its diet. So when we're talking about seasonality, 99% of the time fruit and vegetables. There might be certain instances where certain fish would have been available in your environment at certain times of the year only, but most of the time we're talking about fruit and vegetables and how they change across the seasons. So why is seasonal eating better for you? So just to give you a list of a couple things. Very first one is higher nutrient content. So, gone are the days we used to be able to walk into a shop and be excited because you saw strawberries on the shelf. These days you can get fruit, any time of the year because it's imported from Spain or Mexico, wherever it is. We import food so that you can have, year-round, you can get access to any kind of food that you want. And one of the problems with this is that in order to travel or to get the food transported between two places, they will actually pick the fruit a bit earlier. And then they will artificially stop it from ripening and then only re-ripen it when it is at its final destination. So because it gets picked earlier, what tends to happen is those fruits or whatever plant it is going to have a much lower nutrient content because it didn't get that full amount of time in order to develop out in nature. The second thing is that you're going to be getting seasonal appropriate nutrients. So we're going to discuss this a little bit later. And I'm only going to give you maybe like one aspect really of where seasonality affects, what kind of nutrients you should be digesting at that time of year. But if you follow this approach, you're basically knocking out every single aspect. I mean, I don't pretend to know every single frequency of light and how that could correlate with food. There are so many different ways that they could be connected, our food and our light environment, which we're going to discuss now. But by following this approach, you're making sure that you are literally ticking all the boxes in terms of the appropriate nutrients for your body at the appropriate time of year. Money saved, obviously, if you're eating from a local source, then it means that they don't have to consider the costs of transporting the food. Any like fruit or that is imported will always be a little bit more expensive because obviously there's the cost involved with transporting it from the place where it's produced to the shelf where you're buying it. And then the last one is that you're supporting local farmers. Now this obviously ties in with money saved. And just out of the goodness of your heart, you should support local farmers in your area. But also what you need to consider is the local farmers in your area, they don't have to have the costs involved in transporting their fruits further, or any plants again, further, which means that they've probably got more money to allocate towards the quality of the food. So where something that's got to be transported to another destination, they have these extra costs. You just probably do run the risk that they're going to be cutting some corners. You're probably not going to get organic. You don't get such a thing as free-range bananas, but you're probably not going to get organic or well looked after kind of food, because when they need to import it, they need to maximize their yield and lower their costs as much as possible in order to account for the costs of transporting the food. And now to jump into the link between light and your diet. As I said already, there's probably a lot more than what I'm going to cover today, but this is probably one of the biggest ones in terms of the seasonality of a certain type of light and a certain type of food that you should be eating. So a quote I just wanted to give you, this is something was posted out by Jack Kruse. So it says, "The sun creates all food, therefore light creates all diets. Diets based around bad light gives horrendous results. Hashtag photosynthesis facts." And what he's talking about here is the photosynthetic web. So if you think of what tie is there between the food in our environment and us, it's light. We are being exposed to the same type of light, and our body is responding to the same, or it should be in nature, the same type of light that the food is growing under. So the seasonality that happens with the food in our environment has to do with the sun, and the seasonality that happens within our bodies because of sunlight exposure, that's sharing the same sun. And there's some very distinct ties between these two things if you want to match up a seasonal diet and your light environment. So I'm not going to jump into the science too much of light, but a very brief thing I just want you to understand in terms of how the seasonality of light changes across seasons. If you look on this image over here, we've got the electromagnetic spectrum. I'm just showing the visible spectrum of light. But what I want you to know is that on the right-hand side, you can see like red and orange. They have a longer wavelength or a lower frequency. And if you look on the left, you can see things like blue, indigo, and violet. They have a higher frequency, but a shorter wavelength. Now why? There's only one reason why this is important for now, and that is the fact that the longer the wavelength, so the further on the right of that graph, the better that type of light is able to travel through our atmosphere. So when you look in summer versus winter, what you will find is that in winter, the sun will predominantly be on the right-hand side. That type of light will be the biggest proportion of light that you would be getting from the sun. Whereas in summer months, on the left-hand side, that's when you will start to still have some aspects of the violet or even ultraviolet range pop up more. This is a generalization. This could be different depending on where in the world you are, but based just on seasons, it's more likely that in summer you'll be exposed more to more light on the left than you would in winter. But even in summer months, you're still going to have a very high portion of red and infrared. It's still going to be the dominant frequency of light. But just to understand that in summer months, that's when you would most likely get exposed to violet and ultraviolet light, which the reason why that is important is because ultraviolet light has a seasonality factor in our bodies because it helps our bodies to produce vitamin D, which is obviously a hormone that helps us to, as many different things, helps us to boost our immune system, but one of the things that it helps us to do is to digest carbohydrates. So if you think about it, this is where the link between light and your diet come in. In summer months, when we're getting longer light cycles and there's more ultraviolet light, us as humans, we're going to be having higher levels of vitamin D. And then in our environment, because there's stronger light cycles through photosynthesis, the plants in our environment are going to be able to produce more fruit, therefore more carbohydrates. So there's the direct link, a very important link between our light environment and our food, is that the stronger the light cycles, the more likely we'll have vitamin D, the more likely we'll be able to digest carbohydrates better, and obviously the higher chances that there's going to be more carbohydrates in your environment. Just to show you a quick little study, so there was one that said the impact of vitamin D replacement in glucose metabolism. What they basically did is they took 66 subjects who were all pre-diabetic, and they found that a whopping 93.9% of them had a vitamin D deficiency. And they basically did an intervention where they supplemented these people with vitamin D. And the conclusion they found at the end of the studies after all of the results was that vitamin D deficiency was very common in our study population. In vitamin D deficient patients, supplementation treatment improved insulin resistance and glycemic parameters. Vitamin D replacement may be a promising intervention for the primary prevention of insulin resistance syndromes. Now, obviously, the conclusion is always taken out by the researchers how they want to interpret the results. And as you can see at the end of this, they see that vitamin D helps you to improve insulin resistance, so therefore helps you to digest carbohydrates better. Their end conclusion is to take a tablet or to do some kind of vitamin D replacement. As you know, you can get that from the sun. Ultraviolet light in summer, if that comes into contact with your skin, then your body is able to make vitamin D by converting cholesterol into vitamin D. So this is just a study. I just wanted to basically point out that it does show that vitamin D is essential for digesting carbohydrates properly. Another thing that's very interesting to note is that latitude, where on the world you are in terms of how north or south of the equator, is a risk factor in developing diabetes, type 1 diabetes in this case. But what they found is that the further away from the equator you are, the more likely you are to be type 1 diabetic. And this makes sense because the further away from the equator you are, the lower or the weaker the light cycles and the lower the chances that you're going to be exposed to ultraviolet light. So if you think about it, the people who are living in these more northern or more southern climates, they're now able to eat carbohydrates, fruits and stuff like that that would never grow in their kind of environment, and they can eat that year-round now, but they're not linking that up with their light cycle. And as a consequence, one of the factors we're seeing here is that there could be a risk, one of the risk factors that's listed in developing diabetes is your latitude. So just another kind of nail in the coffin to show the link between light and your food that you should be eating. So as a general approach, this is just something that I follow, is that this is also a very generalized kind of thing, but in winter months, you should be looking at going like low to no carbohydrate. For me, I personally will go like carnivore, so I will actually eat like 0 carbohydrates in these months. And that's also, it's not just to do with the winter months, it's also to do with my genetic makeup. I'm 92% Northwestern European, which means I am from a colder kind of climate. You can see I've got pretty pale skin. People who are lighter skin complexion, their ancestry would be from a more northern or southern climate in general. So that you can, without having to do some kind of genetic test, you could just, thumb guess it that if you're a lighter complexion, then you would more likely be able to, or you should be focusing more on a low to 0 carbohydrate diet in winter months. In summer months, you still can go to like moderate carbohydrates. I personally I never gone to a high carbohydrate diet, but I don't think it's maybe a healthy thing to sustain like a very strong ketogenic diet for a long time. So in summer months, I will then, start including some fruits, some root vegetables, potatoes even, onions, sauerkraut, fermented kind of things, nothing that's, really crazy, it's going to hurt my digestive system or anything like that. I'm not, eating like oats or rice or that kind of stuff. But in terms of healthy carbohydrates that you would find in your environment in a seasonal manner, you can include that in summer months. And then the last thing that we're going to jump into is some diet hacks for a modern lifestyle. So these are things that aren't necessarily, we can, as much as we want to look at it and go, okay, this is how our ancestors ate, we need to make some kind of variations in order to adjust to a modern lifestyle. And the very first thing I just want to point out, and this is probably not something that you want to hear, but if you're not getting out in the sun, especially in summer, then that means no fruit, it means no carbohydrates. So you can't think, based on this video, and I've told you, okay, in summer months there's more ultraviolet light outside, therefore you can have more carbohydrates. If you're working an office job and you're sitting inside, you cannot justify, eating carbohydrates if you're still extremely pale and you're not getting your vitamin D levels up. What the sun is doing outside has no impact on your physiology. You would probably be better off eating a low carbohydrate diet. And I suspect, this is a theory of mine, that's one of the reasons why so many people do so well on a ketogenic diet, is because most people are just void of getting outside into natural light exposure. I'm really hoping in the next few years that we're going to start seeing some studies where they start going, okay, well, if we put people outside, would they maybe thrive on a moderate carbohydrate diet? Because I think, this whole ketogenic kind of craze that is happening at the moment might be masking an underlying issue where people aren't getting enough natural light exposure, especially in the summer months. So just a precaution here. If you're not getting outside, don't think that you can follow a natural diet and eat a whole bunch of carbohydrates in summer if you're not getting that type of light. Another thing this is very important to talk about is DHA. It's a type of omega-3. Jack Kruse always talks about it at length, and it's why he's always telling you to eat a ton of seafood. And in this quote, he's basically saying DHA is the only lipid in 600 million years that has the ability to turn light into a DC electric signal. Now, the reason why this is important to understand is because we, essentially, when we started with evolution, we were from like an equatorial kind of region. And as we started venturing more north or more south of the equator, we basically needed to adapt to shorter light cycles, so less sunlight. And our bodies needed to figure out how we could do that. One of the ways is a lighter skin complexion. People who are lighter skin complexion will burn easier, and that's because they're absorbing a lot more light. They don't need as much light in order to make the same amount of vitamin D. Another thing is our diet actually started to change because we started to get more DHA in our diet. And as Jack's pointed out here, that helps your body to turn light into a DC electric signal, which basically just means generate energy in layman's terms. And how this happened, which is very interesting, is if you look at any fish or seafood along the equator, again, as a general rule, the amount of DHA in that fish tends to increase the further north or the further south you go from the equator. So they have the same kind of thing where they're using DHA in order to use these low light cycles. And what we found is that as we started venturing more north and more south, our diet started having more DHA in it, and therefore we were able to adjust to a environment which had less natural light. Now, this is where Jack Kruse will talk about the epi-paleo diet, which means, paleo diet, and then epi means on top of. So his diet prescription is to have a lot more seafood and a lot more DHA in your diet, because it means if you're living inside and you're not living outside in a natural environment, you need to basically offset that by making sure that you're getting enough DHA in your diet, that when you do go outside, you're absorbing it better. You're basically eating the diet that would be for a low light environment. I personally, my goal one day is to not have to eat so much seafood, because obviously there are risks associated with it. There's high levels of mercury in fish these days. But in order to do that, you need to make sure that you're getting outside and getting enough natural light exposure. So depending on how your lifestyle is at the moment, you need to consider if you're sitting inside and you're not getting outside enough, not getting enough natural light exposure, if it's only an hour a day kind of thing, then you probably want to be eating a lot more whole fish. And I'll give you some examples. I'm not a fan of supplementing DHA. I think in natural sources, some of the best things are like your oily fish, and then things like, so it's oysters, salmon, mackerel, sardines, and anchovies. Those are just some really good examples of fish, seafood that is higher in DHA. And then the last thing that we're going to be talking about is vitamin D in winter. So I've already told you that in summer months, that's when you're going to get the type of light, ultraviolet B light, that is going to help you to make vitamin D. But there are food sources of vitamin D that you can eat in winter in order to kind of tide yourself through. It's not the primary mechanism for how your body makes vitamin D. That still is through sunlight. But some of the food sources include oily fish. Again, you're hitting out your DHA and you're going to get some vitamin D through oily fish. Red meat is another great source of vitamin D. Eggs, and then mushrooms is another good one as well. Those are the kind of foods you should be looking at, including in winter months, if you want to tide yourself through with your vitamin D levels. That brings us to the end of this video. So that covers seasonal eating. I know that I haven't given you a specific diet plan on here, but as I mentioned in the beginning, you should be able to figure out now what works best for you. One parting kind of advice I'd like to give you is that actually go out there and start trying to meet like your local farmers. Instead of going to the supermarket, go to a farmer's market and start talking to the people there. Find out what kind of crops they're producing. And in your specific area, you'll quickly find out, what type of fruits, vegetables, that kind of thing are in season or out of season at certain times of the year. Because if you go to the supermarket, you're not going to get any idea. You're going to find that they've got everything because they've imported it from all over the world. Whereas if you go to a farmer's market, you can speak to the farmer, find out, did he grow this himself? Some farmer's markets, you have to be careful. Maybe they have imported stuff and they're just selling it on their shelves. But speaking to people in your local area is going to be the best way for you to figure out what kind of fruit and vegetables you should be including in your diet at that time of year. If you guys have any questions, you can email me. It's nick@mitochondria.com. Other than that, I hope that you have a fantastic day further, and we'll chat again soon. Cheers.